You're walking through the streets of ancient Rome in the year 67 AD, and you witness something that makes your blood run cold. The emperor himself, Nero, is strolling through the forum. At his side, what appears to be his new wife, a stunning young woman draped in silk and jewels. But whispers follow in their wake. Because everyone knows the horrifying truth. That woman, beside the most powerful man in the world, was once a boy named Sporus. And what Nero did to him represents one of the most disturbing acts of psychological and physical abuse in recorded history. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below and let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together, from different parts of the world. Connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Roman excess. It's the story of how absolute power can twist love into obsession, grief into madness, and a human being into a living doll, created to serve one man's darkest fantasy. The name Sporus might not be familiar to you, but his story, it will haunt you, long after you finish listening. Let's begin, with the man who would become the architect of this tragedy. Nero wasn't born evil. In fact, his early reign showed remarkable promise. When he ascended to the throne at just 16 years old, many Romans believed they were witnessing the dawn of a new golden age. He reduced taxes. He funded public entertainment. He even performed in theatrical productions that delighted the common people. But absolute power has a way of corrupting even the most promising souls. By 65 AD, something had fundamentally broken inside the emperor's mind. Was it the constant paranoia, the knowledge that everyone around him wanted his position? Was it the crushing isolation of being the only person in an empire of 60 million who could never be contradicted, never challenged, never told they were wrong? Or maybe, it was what happened to the one person Nero claimed to love more than life itself. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. She was everything Nero thought he wanted in a woman. Beautiful beyond description. Intelligent enough to mirror his grandiose vision of himself. Ambitious enough to share his dreams of eternal glory. But Poppaea wasn't just another pretty face in the imperial court. She possessed the kind of sharp political instincts that made her a powerful ally, or a very dangerous enemy. When Nero first laid eyes on Poppaea, he was already married, to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor. It had been a cold, loveless, political marriage. Poppaea represented everything Octavia was not. Where Octavia was quiet and reserved, Poppaea was vivacious and commanding. Where Octavia avoided attention, Poppaea reveled in being the center of everyone's gaze. Nero and Poppaea began like any typical Roman scandal. But what started as adultery quickly evolved into something much more dangerous. Genuine obsession. Nero wasn't just attracted to Poppaea's beauty. He was consumed by her. In a way that terrified even his closest advisors. Ancient historians describe Nero's behavior during this period as increasingly erratic, and deeply possessive. He would fly into murderous rages if other men so much as looked at Poppaea for too long. At public functions, he began stationing guards around her at all times. Ostensibly for protection. But really, to monitor her every interaction. He lavished her with gifts that bankrupted the imperial treasury. Jewels from India. Silks from China. Perfumes from Arabia. But perhaps most telling of all, he began to reshape reality itself to accommodate his obsession. First, he divorced Octavia. A shocking move that alienated many of his supporters. Then, he announced his intention to marry Poppaea in a full imperial ceremony. The wedding was a spectacle of unprecedented luxury, with Nero sparing no expense to demonstrate his devotion. But even marriage couldn't satisfy Nero's need to possess Poppaea completely. He began to isolate her from family and friends, surrounding her with people who owed everything to his favor. People who would never challenge him. People who would never say no. He commissioned dozens of portraits and sculptures of her. Not just for public display, but for his private chambers. So he could look upon her image even when they were apart. Ancient sources tell us that Nero would sometimes spend hours, simply watching Poppaea as she went about her daily activities. This wasn't romantic devotion. It was the behavior of someone who had confused love with ownership. Who saw another human being not as an independent person, but as a beautiful object that existed solely for his pleasure. Poppaea, for her part, seemed to understand the dangerous game she was playing. She was intelligent enough to recognize that her beauty, and Nero's obsession, had given her unprecedented power. But she was also shrewd enough to know that power came with enormous risks. She began using her influence to advance her family's interests, quietly building a network of supporters who could protect her if Nero's affections ever began to waver. But Poppaea had one fatal flaw. She wasn't afraid to stand up to Nero. Unlike everyone else in the imperial court, who had learned to tiptoe around the emperor's moods, Poppaea retained her independence of spirit. She would argue with him about policy decisions, criticize his artistic pursuits, even mock his performances when she thought they were subpar. The details of what happened on that fateful day in 65 AD vary, depending on which ancient historian you believe. But the outcome is always the same. During what began as a typical domestic argument, some sources say it was about Nero coming home late from the chariot races. Others claim it had to do with his obsession with the stage. The emperor lost control, in a way that would haunt him forever. According to Tacitus, the argument escalated when Poppaea dared to criticize Nero's priorities, suggesting he cared more about his public image than his responsibilities as a husband, and as a father. She was pregnant at the time, carrying what would have been their second child. And perhaps the stress made her less willing to tolerate. Nero's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. What happened next has been debated by historians for centuries. But the consensus is chilling. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Nero either kicked or struck his pregnant wife with such brutal force that she suffered fatal internal injuries. Some sources describe a single, devastating blow to her abdomen. Others say it was a sustained assault, one that left her bleeding and unconscious on the cold marble floor. Imagine the moment Nero realized what he had done. This man, who commanded 30 legions, who could have anyone executed with a word, who was worshipped as a god in the eastern provinces, had just destroyed the one thing he actually cared about. The woman he had obsessed over for years was dying because of his own violence. Ancient sources describe the aftermath as one of the most pathetic scenes in imperial history. Nero reportedly threw himself onto Poppaea's broken body, alternately begging her for forgiveness and commanding her to live, as if his imperial authority extended even over death itself. He summoned the finest physicians in Rome, offering them unimaginable fortunes to save her life, threatening them with torture if they failed. But it was too late. Poppaea died within hours, taking with her the unborn child, who might have been Nero's heir. In that moment, something fundamental broke inside the emperor's mind. What followed wasn't just grief. It was a complete break from reality. Nero's mourning became the stuff of legend. He refused to have Poppaea's body cremated, as Roman custom demanded. Instead, he had it embalmed and placed in a tomb more elaborate than any previous emperor's. He declared her divine. He established a cult in her honor. He spent days, talking to her corpse, as if she could still hear him. The imperial court suddenly found itself walking on even more treacherous ground. Courtiers were now expected to participate in the fiction that Poppaea was still alive. referring to her in the present tense, leaving her favorite seat empty at banquets. Anyone who dared suggest that the emperor should move on was immediately exiled, or worse. Nero's gaze fell on him. But the young man had no idea, he was walking into a nightmare. Sporus was probably around 14 or 15. Born into slavery within the imperial household, and later freed as a child. He had been raised behind the palace walls, receiving an elite education that prepared him for administrative duties. This was actually a position of relative privilege. Freedmen in imperial service often enjoyed better lives than many freeborn citizens of lower rank. But that privilege came at a cost, complete dependence on imperial favor. They owed everything to their former master's generosity, which meant they lived in a state of absolute vulnerability. They could be elevated to unimaginable heights, or discarded, punished, even executed, on a whim, with no legal protection, and no hope of justice. But what made Sporus special in Nero's eyes wasn't his intelligence. It wasn't his education. It was his face. Multiple ancient sources agree. The young man bore an uncanny resemblance to the late Poppaea, especially around the eyes, and the delicate bone structure of his face. And in a world where Romans believed that physical resemblance signaled a deeper spiritual connection, that likeness would have felt almost supernatural. The first time Nero saw Sporus after Poppaea's death, something clicked in the emperor's broken mind. Here, before him, was a chance. A chance to undo the irreversible. A chance to bring back what he had destroyed. The resemblance was so striking that for a moment, Nero's gaze locked onto him. But the young man had no idea, he was walking into a nightmare. Sporus was likely around 14 or 15 years old. Born into slavery within the imperial household and later freed as a child. He had been raised inside the palace walls, receiving an elite education that prepared him for administrative duties. It was a position of relative privilege. Freedmen in imperial service often lived better than many freeborn citizens of the lower classes. But this privilege came with a dangerous price, absolute dependence on the emperor's favor. They owed everything to their former master's generosity. And that meant they could be elevated to great influence, or discarded, punished, or executed on a whim, with no legal recourse, no appeal, no mercy. But what made Sporus stand out to Nero wasn't his intelligence, wasn't his education. It was his face. Multiple ancient sources agree. Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead Poppaea, particularly around the eyes, and in his delicate bone structure. In a world where Romans believed physical resemblance revealed deeper, spiritual connections, that similarity would have seemed almost supernatural. The first time Nero laid eyes on Sporus after Poppaea's death, something clicked in the emperor's fractured mind. Here, before him, was a chance. A chance to undo the irreversible. A chance to bring back what he had destroyed. The resemblance was so striking that for a moment, Nero may have actually believed he was seeing Poppaea's spirit returned in a new form. Of course, there was one obvious problem. Sporus was male. But for a man who had convinced himself he was a god, a man who had spent months talking to a corpse, changing someone's gender seemed like a minor obstacle. What happened next would become one of the most calculated and disturbing acts of cruelty in human history.